Representation matters. But as indigenous Chicano people, we can't just sit back and wait for mainstream media outlets to make it happen for us. And nor should we. We started the Tales from Aztlantis podcast because we believe that it is imperative for Chicanos, Chicanas, and Chicanx people to produce our own media and tell our own stories. And the way we choose to do this is by using Buzzsprout to host the podcast. Buzzsprout is by far the easiest and best way to launch a professional podcast. You'll get a podcast website, audio players that you can drop into other websites, detailed analytics to see how people are listening, tools to promote your episodes, and much more. To start your own podcast and get a $20 Amazon gift card, follow the link in the show notes. This lets Buzzsprout know that we sent you and helps support the show. Buzzsprout, the easiest way to start a podcast. Now, on with the show.
You must excuse me. I've grown quite weary.
This hasn't been easy, I know. But you've learned a lesson. A lesson in honesty. Honesty to yourself and honesty to others. That lesson will stand you in good stead all your life.
I think we've all learned a good lesson. I've always heard that honesty is the best policy. Now I'm catching on to why that's so, and why that's so, and why that's so, and why that's so.
Greetings, dear listeners, and welcome to yet another episode of Tales from Aztlantis. We are your hosts, Kurly Tlapoyawa.
And Ruben Arellano Tlakatekatl.
What is up, homie?
What's going on, Curl?
It's been too long.
Oh, it's just been yesterday. What are you talking about?
Season 4.
Season
wild.
4. Man, never did I imagine we'd be doing 4 seasons of Tales from Aztlantis.
I know. It seems like only yesterday we were standing over the decomposing intellectual corpses of so many Latinxers that we felled with our sharp wit.
And you can still smell the stink of the flesh.
Absolutely.
Matul.
And we were like, you know what? This is kind of fun, taking out all these tontos. So we decided to make a podcast out of it.
That's right. And we're back.
And we are back, gente. So how have things been, man? How's the teaching going?
Teaching is going pretty good. I can't complain. Still doing what I do, and the students still are taking my classes, so I must be doing something right.
I read you had posted some of the responses, right? On unnamed, anonymous responses, of course. But
right.
You'd pointed out how capable, intellectually capable your students are. And I read some of their analysis.
Oh, yeah. My students are bright. They're intelligent. They're eager to learn things that they've never been exposed to. And in my Mexican-American history class, for instance, some of my students are very shocked to learn a lot of the things that happened to indigenous peoples, for instance, during the Spanish colonial period, during, the push northward. And then, this is for Mexican-American History 1. Right now we're covering the period of the latter part of the 19th century. And so a lot of my students are beginning to learn about the Texas Rangers and, why they were created to begin with, which was initially to protect the so-called settlers, the Anglo settlers that were coming in against what they called, quote-unquote, depredations of the indigenous people, the Indians, right? And so, and then, once the native populations are pacified, the code word for oppressed and subjugated and put in control, then the Texas Rangers are put to use against Mexican Americans, especially in South Texas and along the border. And the violence turns very aggressive during the decade of 1910 to 1920 during the Mexican Revolution, because a lot of people were immigrating, fleeing the revolution. Mm-hmm. And yes, you did have people on the Mexican side who took advantage of that to commit crimes and what have you. But then on the U.S. side, Anglo ranchers, the Texas Rangers, and oftentimes also the U.S. Army, who were patrolling the border, to prevent any violence to bleed over to the American side, would be involved in actions against so-called quote-unquote bandits. So if you were a Mexican-American community, you just happen to be a community that's along the border, and let's say, maybe you did have some Mexican bandits or revolutionaries across the border to come in and commit some kind of crime. Whenever those people weren't found, innocent community members would be targeted and be labeled as bandits. And so there's a lot of atrocities and massacres that occurred. And in fact, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but I'm a founding member of the Mexican American Museum of Texas. And this year we're going to be putting on our third exhibit. And it's going to be on exactly that. It's called the original organization who put this together is called Refusing to Forget. And the exhibit is called Life and Death Along the Border, 1910 and 1920. And so we're excited about that. And so my students, when they learn this stuff, they have a visceral reaction, especially my Mexican American students, because, why weren't they taught this in school? And so, yeah.
Yeah, right. If you've never heard this before and you're hearing it for the first time, and it's something that, is super important, you're like, well, what the fuck? How come I never learned this?
Yeah.
Especially in the place that I live, right? It relates directly to where I live and to my own experience and the experience of my family, but it's just ignored.
Absolutely. So that's what I do. And so I'm proud to be doing that, and I'm going to continue to do it until, until I retire, or until they tell me I can't tell the truth anymore, You can't do it no more. But then I'm going to tell them, hey, have you ever heard about the medicine of the truth? Anyway. Sometimes it might sting. It might sting.
Just a little bit. Well, I have exciting news. March 22nd, the movie that I've been working on at Nickelodeon for Netflix will be released on Netflix.
This is the one with Miguel Puga?
Yes.
Casagrandes.
Yes, the Casagrandes movie. So for those who don't know, Casagrandes was a series on Nickelodeon about a Mexican-American family. And in the movie, they have some awesome indigenous-themed adventures. I think that's all I'm allowed to say right now. The trailer hasn't been released yet, but they did announce the film. They released the cast, and they put out some of the
and what was your role in
images
in the movie?
Promo images. So I am one of the cultural consultants, and I had a big hand in crafting the look of certain indigenous characters.
Okay.
And bringing in a lot of accuracy to representations of indigenous peoples, as the story directly relates to indigeneity and being a Chicano.
And in your opinion, do you think that they stay true to the spirit of what you brought to the table, or? Yeah,
from everything I've seen, I'm very proud of it. I mean, it's a kids movie, and you got to have some leeway. Some of the names of the characters, because they're based on, quote unquote, gods and goddesses of the Purepecha people, and a lot of the names.
What do they call it? The Purepecha. Do they call them gods and goddesses?
Currently, yeah. I mean, in modern times, yeah.
Right. No, but like back then,
they have their own word. But yeah, you know what? I don't know exactly what that word.
Because the Nahuatl is Teot, right?
Yeah.
Teot.
Or Teteo.
Teteo.
Yeah.
So.
But yeah, so the their names. When I brought forward, like, okay, if we're gonna have these characters in this movie, here are their names. And some of their names were just, they deemed them too difficult for young people to pronounce.
Okay.
Or for the actors to even pronounce. So we had to simplify their names. So there were some concessions like that. But overall, man, I'm super super proud of the way that this came out.
So is it like, for instance, Huitzilopochtli is simplified to Huitzi or something like that?
So it would be something like that, right?
Okay.
Where maybe Huitzilopochtli would be, simplified to just the word for hummingbird, Huitzi.
Yeah, Huitzi. So people that know Purepecha culture and history
They'll recognize.
They'll recognize the names. Okay.
Yeah.
That's good.
And the characters portrayed, in it. And I was able, luckily, to get Nickelodeon to hire a family of Purepecha speakers to come in and consult and help us with the dialogue, because there is some dialogue in Purepecha, which I'm really proud of.
Is it dubbed, or what are they? Is it not dubbed but subbed? Not dubbed, subbed.
Yeah, it'll be the parts that are in Purepecha will have subtitles, and then there's a moment where they switch over to English, and we try to make that as organic as possible when that moment happens in the movie.
Is it the same voice actors doing Purepecha in English?
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
I even have some. So I also play two characters in the movie.
Oh, so you have speaking roles in the nice.
Two speaking roles, and one of them is in Purepecha. So
wow,
it's exciting.
I bet.
So I'm
Well,
excited for people to see it.
Thanks for the update. I'm sure our audience is dying to go support this.
Yeah, it's very cool, and a lot of really cool voice actors worked on it. So it's exciting. I recorded.
Is it people that we know, that the audience will know? They'll recognize the names.
Sergio Aragones, the Mexican cartoonist.
Yeah,
he plays one of the characters. Lalo Alcaraz worked on the movie as well. Miguel Puga, Carlos Alezraqui, who
not familiar with him.
I think he's he might be famous for Reno 911. He played I forget which character he was in Reno 911, but he was the Taco Bell Chihuahua. I think was probably his most famous.
What? The Yo Quiero Taco Bell?
Yeah.
That was him?
Yeah, Carlos Alezraqui. So, and one of the characters is played by I can't remember her name right now. I'm on the spot, but she played Maria in Sesame Street. So.
Oh right. Damn, I'm blanking on her name too.
But I mean,
terrible.
How cool is that I got to work on something with somebody from Sesame Street. I'm very, very
that
excited
is awesome.
about that.
Yeah.
So, it's a movie, all the other movies I've worked on as a stunt guy or an actor in horror movies, I never made anything that was like explicitly kid friendly. And now that I have a granddaughter, I've made this, movie that she can watch and enjoy. And that's directly related to her culture. So
all those past experiences have led to this.
Yes. It's pretty cool.
Nice.
And then we've got some other projects in the mix with Nickelodeon. I worked on the reboot of Dora the Explorer, so
what?
I did some
no way
cultural consulting for that. And
so there was a question. I'm not sure where I saw this. It was somewhere on the socials, and there's a debate as to whether she was supposed to be Mexican American from Central or South America, or do you care to comment on that at all?
So one of the points that was made in these early meetings for the reboot of Dora the Explorer was, and this is their word, not mine, they were like, in the past, Dora was like this ambiguous pan-Latina character, but they've decided that, she's going to be like a kid who has a Mexican parent and a Colombian parent. So I just made
sure.
So
why Mexican Colombian? I mean, I'm sure our Venezuelan friends are wondering, why not Venezuelan?
I think it's because the producers of the reboot are Colombian.
Okay. So we got the Mexican Colombian connection here.
Yeah.
It's pretty strong.
Yeah, so I went in there and just tried to Mexicanize the shit out of Dora the Explorer.
Nice.
And
can't wait to see it.
Yeah, it's exciting. So and then recently I was in Oaxaca, and while there I was able to do some research for not only, for myself and enjoying myself and shoot this documentary that I'm working on about Oaxacan pottery, but while I was there I was able to do some research for this other project that I'm working on for Nickelodeon. So
there's two more you have the Casa Grandes, you have Dora the Explorer, and then there's another one.
And then the untitled super secret project that Miguel Puga brought me on to work on.
Okay. So you're pretty busy.
I try to be.
Yeah. I mean, because it's my understanding you have some extra free time now.
I do. I was a director, turns out in name only, of a nonprofit organization, a really, really cool mission, really amazing clients, cool people, the community that we created for this. It's a coffee shop, nonprofit coffee shop and bakery, where we provided workforce development training to people in recovery, right? And so I got to work with some really cool people and do some amazing things. But, found out some really unfortunate shit about this place, and then had some unfortunate shit happen. So I turned in my resignation, and shortly after turning in my resignation, I was asked to leave after they, collected all the passwords and logins and stuff from me. They were like, tell them to go home and not come back. So,
wow.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. And I mean, the place was just transformed within a week from this awesome community-centered place where clients felt safe, they were just getting back on their feet. You know what I mean? Like, some of these people hadn't had a real job ever. Mm-hmm. And now they're getting this opportunity to develop skills that will enable them to live like a life that's meaningful and
So that's not happening anymore?
Oh man, it just went to shit really, really fast. Like, the whole vibe changed. They one of the first things they did was they changed the coffee that we were using, because this other coffee, I don't know what it's like garbage fucking gas station coffee that they're serving now. It's really unfortunate. And, it used to have a very punk rock vibe to it, like community, the gente taking care of people.
Yeah.
And now it's just like another lame ass fucking hipster wannabe corporate shit show of a coffee shop. So
what I'm hearing is that it's profit over people.
Oh, absolutely. That should be the motto of Ancora Cafe and Bakery. Profit over people.
It just seems weird to me that you were on vacation / working on your new documentary in Oaxaca, and as soon as you come back, you drop this news on everyone that follows you on the socials. So, do you think that this was kind of in the works while you were, like, they waited for you to go on vacation for a week?
Yeah, that's exactly what happened, man. Because day one that I was gone, my phone started blowing up from coworkers and clients, and they're like, "What the fuck is happening here, man?" Like, they brought in some consultant who was being a real dickhead to our clients, which really pissed me off. Super disrespectful, doesn't understand what the mission was supposed to be, and didn't care, honestly. And they're like, the day you were gone, day one, they brought in this guy to start making all these changes.
Wow. So it's like they planned this, so you must have, like, you told them ahead of time, I'm assuming, that you're going on this trip.
Oh yeah, they knew for a while.
They knew, and so they started maybe planning since back then, you think?
I assume, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I have no reason to think otherwise, right? It's just, as soon as I got back...
It's so abrupt. Like, it just happened so fast, right? Like, you were working there one day, everything was fine. You go on vacation, you come back, and it's all gone to hell.
And it's a shit show. Yeah, it's unfortunate. Wow. I feel really bad for the clients because the place was supposed to be for them.
Yeah.
But
that's too bad.
Yeah. On a lighter
I was looking
note,
forward to checking out the Ancora Cafe on my next trip to Albuquerque.
Well,
but I guess,
my friend, there might be other things in the works. So we'll see what the future holds.
Okay.
We don't know yet, but there may be things in the works behind the scenes. And on a brighter note, I thought it would be fun for our first episode back to do sort of a grab bag of different topics. Instead of devoting an entire episode to one sole topic, maybe we grab some topics that perhaps do not warrant entire episodes of their own, but that we feel are important enough to address, right? So I asked you to pick 2 topics, and I myself have picked 2 topics. And if you don't mind, because my first topic is very short, but it informs our show in general. I think that this topic informs the spirit of our show and the podcast as a whole. And it's basically topic number 1 would be the difference between a fact and a theory, because as a scientist scrolling through social media, I get agitated every time I see somebody downplay something as a theory and saying, well, it's not a fact, it's just a theory, you know? So like you'll always see this with the Beringian hypothesis, right? Well, the Bering Land Strait is just a theory, it's not a fact. And I'm like, you're using it all wrong. Or I saw a meme that people have been sharing lately, and it shows the sunstone in the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, with people looking up at it. It's a photograph, and it says, you know, our history was written in stone, you know, not just theory. You know, our history is not just a theory; it's fact written in stone, or something like that. And I'm like, oh my god, you guys got to stop doing this.
Okay, so I get the first one, but why does that one bother you so much? I mean, they're just kind of being, you know, a little folksy and, you know,
it's just the misuse.
A way to get people's attention, right? To say,
it's just the misuse of the words. Like, I have nothing wrong with saying our history is written in stone. Yeah. Even though it was also written on paper and you know, painted on walls, and you know, we had a lot of history that was written down. But it's just the way that they're misusing. It's like they don't understand the scientific method.
But what about the history? I mean, are they saying that the history is also written in stone and that they know how to interpret the stone? And
that they know how to read it somehow. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess I can see that.
But
that is problematic.
When you're looking at, you know, what is a fact? A fact, you know, it's all a fact is a confirmed observation. That's all a fact is. So, but it's like if you were looking at the importance of the hierarchy of knowledge, like a ladder, a fact would be on the bottom rung, because a fact is just a confirmed observation. It's something that we see, that we can confirm, that we can agree upon, right? And the most important part of it is way up on top, and that's the theory. A theory is the important part of that ladder. So let me make an example. All right. So let's say I pick up a pencil and I let go of the pencil. The pencil, unless I'm in space, when I pick up a pencil and let go of it, the pencil's going to fall. Right? It's going to drop down to the ground or to the floor if I'm inside. So that's the fact. That's our confirmed observation, is that when we hold something up and let go of it, it falls. So then we look at that fact, we can use that fact to formulate a hypothesis, right? To ask a question, to be like, well, if I'm holding something up and I let go of it and it falls, maybe it's because something is pulling it down, right? So that's the hypothesis. And then we can conduct experiments using that hypothesis to test these, you know, are confirmed observations.
Mm-hmm.
And in time, we would come to the conclusion that there's this thing called gravity that's causing the stuff to fall whenever we let go of it. Gravity's the theory. The pencil falling is the fact. So if you think of it this way, the theory is what explains everything. The theory is what lets us know why this stuff is happening. And in order for something to become a theory, it has to be tested multiple times. It has to be repeatable. Other people have to be able to test it and come to the same conclusions, right? And that's the strength of science, is that when we come up with a hypothesis, we formulate this idea based on facts. The first thing we start trying to do is disprove ourselves, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, how can I prove myself wrong? Because if I can't prove everything wrong, then there would be only one explanation left. The strongest explanation would become the theory. And so it's just aggravating to see people misuse these ideas all the time. Like, well, that's just a theory, especially when it's something like the Bering Strait, which is like the best explanation we have for the peopling of the Americas. They dismiss it like, well, that's not a fact, it's a theory. So I've always wanted to like get that off my chest on this show.
Just for the record.
For the record, people.
Well, that leads into my topic. Were you done, or were you?
Yes, absolutely.
Continue?
And I was hoping it would lead into this topic that you picked.
Because independently of you, I mean, I knew you were going to talk about facts versus theory. My first topic for this episode, one of the things that really grinds my gears, is associated with this thing called the Bering Strait, but more specifically, this idea that's come to be known as Indian creationism, mm-hmm. right? So think of like biblical creationism, this idea that God created everything, and we've only been around for 6,000 years. So there's an idea among indigenous peoples, Native American people in particular, that is now being referred to as Indian creationism, because it's very similar. This notion that, we couldn't have come from the Bering Strait because, as you were saying, it's just a, quote unquote theory, right? Like that's the first way that it's been dismissed. But then, in addition to that, as a historian, I can appreciate it because you have oral histories, right? Indigenous societies around the world. This isn't something that's just unique to Native Americans or Indigenous Americans, but just around the world, people have creation stories that are passed down orally as a tradition that describes, the people's origin. And sometimes it might explain where they come from, how they were created on Earth, and oftentimes a lot of Native creation stories deal with indigenous peoples being created or being sort of taken from underground to the above ground, where we are now, right? So there's different planes. You have the underworld and you have the world. And in many cases, creation stories talk about how certain peoples came from the underworld. Sometimes they're led to the world above by some kind of spirit animal, a deer, a turtle. Sometimes is used in terms of like if that underworld happens to be a sea world, for instance, like a river or a sacred spring. As a Coahuiltecan, a member of the Miacan Garza, that's one of the creation stories that we have as a people, right? And so what I do with my classes with history, when I explain it to the students, I tell students, look, you can have both things, and they don't necessarily need to be in conflict with your existence. Yes. You can have your cultural or biblical, spiritual understanding of creation based on some deity that created the world, or your oral history about how your people came to be on Earth. And in addition to that, you can also, believe what the science says about the origins of man, of humans, how we, came out of Africa. And I show them this map, that shows the migration patterns from out of Africa, and it shows how in various stages you had one group that comes out of Africa and they make a sharp turn into Asia, into the area that's now, I guess, considered like the Caucasus in that area. And then from there, you have another wave that makes a sharp left turn into Europe, and those people end up becoming modern day Europeans. And then the ones that go to the left end up becoming Asians in general. And then you have other branches off of that. Some go south into what is now India and the subcontinent. And then you also have another branch that ends up in like the most easternmost part of Siberia. And that's the branch of humans that ends up becoming native people in the Americas, right? And so, but it takes millennia. I explained to my students, it takes several thousands of years for these people to become a whole new set of people that's different from those Asians that went southward and different from those Europeans that went, westward. And they become an entirely new people. And then once they've become a new people in that space, once the ice corridor melts and people can travel across the Bering Strait, you have two migrations, right? This is what we learned from our friend Jennifer Raff, right? You have, the migration through the ice corridor. And I tell these people, like, when you think of a bridge, because, it's usually framed in terms of the land bridge, I try to explain to them, it's not like your typical bridge that you drive over in a car. This is a huge landmass the size of Texas. That's what they're calling the bridge.
Yeah.
Gigantic landmass. And so you had waves of people that were migrating back and forth before eventually some people just decided to keep on going. And then they spend another several hundred years in that space that's in the Americas now, but it's still like connected to Siberia until that ice corridor melts. And then Beringia. People are able to, Eastern Beringia, and people are able to travel down and begin to populate the rest of the continent. And in addition to that, you have the Kelp Highway, and I explained to them that sort of stuff, right? And so, as an indigenous person, like, who is rational and reasonable, and I guess, materialistic, I guess you can, in scientific terms, you can say that, right? That I value the scientific method, I value empiricism, I value knowledge and facts. I can hold these two separate thoughts in my mind, and they're not in conflict. One is a cultural, spiritual understanding of the world. The other one is based on facts and evidence and scientific reasoning. Those two things don't have to go in conflict. You can have both ideas in one mind.
Exactly.
And be okay.
and it's I don't know, like, it's so dismissive. Like, why would we want to erase that journey that our ancestors made? Like, this amazing journey that they went on, and we just dismiss it outright. Like, nah. Like, what?
Well, what I explain to my students as well, because I've had students also like push back, right? And I tell them, look, the reason why, for instance, a native person might say, and have this very visceral, reaction towards the Bering Strait theory, is because we live in a country where, first of all, indigenous peoples have been oppressed and subjugated, and everything's been taken from them: the land, the culture, the language, the spirituality. And so the last thing they also need is for someone to tell them, oh, you're just another immigrant like we are.
Yeah, you're not even from here.
You're not even from here. And then you have these idiot races that bring in the Solutrean thesis and all this bullshit. And so I explain to my students, I bring all this information to, this is during the first week of class. So I'm already hitting them hard with all this stuff. And they're all like, what is happening, Professor? What's But I try to get them, at the start, so that they understand the framing of the classroom and my approach to history, right? And so I tell them, look, I understand as an indigenous person, I understand where this comes from, this idea to push back and to deny and reject scientific ideas that, seemingly go against what I've been taught, what I believe as a Native person, right? But, you know, it doesn't have to be that way. But I mean, you can, and so I tell my students, you can be an indigenous person that understands the complexity of that conversation, right? Because we're still having that conversation, right? It's still going on. And you can still hold these two separate ideas true, right?
Yeah.
And so while it's reasonable and it's understandable that an indigenous person, that a Native person is going to react a certain way to being told that the Bering Strait is the best theory, right, that we have for the peopling of the Americas, there's nothing wrong with that.
Nope.
And it doesn't negate the fact that if we're talking about first peoples,
Yeah.
regardless
We're
of
still the
when
first
who came,
peoples.
yeah, we're still the first people that came here. So that makes us indigenous.
And everybody came from somewhere. Like that's
Accepting the Bering Strait doesn't deny your
it doesn't
indigeneity.
erase that. And I love creation stories. Like nothing shows the ingenuity and creativity of our ancestors more than creation stories. Like these mind-blowing, beautiful stories of where we came from. And there's so much knowledge encoded, you know, worldview, morals, ethics, these stories that are told that are meant to impart knowledge and teach lessons, like valuable things. And we can hold those and celebrate them while at the same time saying also our ancestors were freaking legit badasses who braved the unknown, who came across this like uninhabitable land chasing megafauna and managed to give rise to all of these remarkable civilizations of
independently on their own without help from anyone else.
Exactly.
And so when I bring that up in class, I compare the way that the quote unquote old world versus the new world, how they developed independently. And one of the things that I stress is I say the reason why, for instance, Europeans were able in 1492 to send someone across the ocean is because they had benefited, right? Kind of going back to Jared Diamond's thesis. I mean, I know that he's gotten criticism for being reductive and such, but I think that there's some merit to what he says, is that Europeans benefited from all the collective knowledge from millennia that you know was gathered from Africa, from the Middle East, from Asia, and then when it finally ended up in Europe, like these people were able to take advantage of all those millennia and all those collected knowledges that kind of came to a head in that space, and so they were able to take advantage of it and do the things that they did, as opposed to our ancestors who, you know, came here, you know, delayed based, you know, as opposed to everyone else who had already settled in their spaces. By the time our ancestors came, you know, they kind of had a late start, and they were still able to develop, you know, without help, civilization, without help, governments, you know, cultivate various foods and create corn, right, and develop mathematical equations to study and predict the stars, and for instance, the eclipse that's coming up. You know, native people understood the movement of the planets and the movement of the stars, and they were able to predict eclipses and able to predict comets and things like that, right? So I explained to them that just because they were late in getting started as opposed to everybody else, it doesn't mean that they weren't just as equally smart as anyone else in the world. It just happened later for them because of the migration that they had to endure.
Exactly.
And as you were saying, that makes them badass because even despite all that, they still were able to manage to do all that stuff.
Yep. Oh, and I want to make one point about the term Indian creationism for our audience. Do not confuse our use of that term with this professor of physical anthropology. Her use of it, her name is Elizabeth Weiss. And she's
that one.
Yeah. She's come out and saying like, oh, well, we basically have to believe in Indian creationism. And her whole argument, which is based entirely in racism, is that she should be allowed to do whatever she wants with human remains of indigenous people, and that any pushback she gets from native people is is because they're trying to use their religious rights, right? Like, so Native peoples are saying, well, hey, we don't do that to our ancestors. You're holding our ancestors. We would like them repatriated so that we can bury them. And she's like, well, you're just being religious fundamentalists. And she started calling them Indian creationists and using that as an excuse to say, well, I get to do whatever I want with the remains of your ancestors. So that's a totally different use of that word. That's not what we're condoning or pushing on this show.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. I had totally forgotten about her. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I try to forget
when
about her.
at least when I use, I'm the one that used it. When I use the term, I just use it to mean the idea that I just explained about the origins. That's it.
Yeah. That we were created here and that we've always been here.
I'm not trying to imply or imbue any sort of negative connotations to it.
I'm just describing it. So for my next topic, sir, I want to talk about something. Speaking of stuff that you should have learned in school, Texas kids should have learned about the Texas Rangers while they were in school. Well, I've got a bone to pick with the teachers of New Mexican history. Here in New Mexico. Because I will tell you this much: you could do a man on the street or a person on the street segment where you just grab a microphone and go to any event in New Mexico and ask them, how did New Mexico get its name? And I'll just bet you right now, 90%, maybe even more, would have no idea how our state got its name. And I'm even willing to go further and say that they probably think that New Mexico, because of its name, New Mexico, was named after the country that, the current nation of Mexico. I think that seems to be...
Old Mexico. Yeah. I think that's what they usually call it, Old Mexico.
Yeah, they would call it Old Mexico, right? So they have this idea that our state is named after the country of Mexico, but that is absolutely not the case, and I just want to lay that to rest. I would like to say once and for all, but I seriously doubt that this podcast will kill this once and for all, but maybe it'll inform enough people that there will be more, knowledge floating around out there about...
Spread the word, folks.
Yeah, where our state got its name. And the reason why New Mexico is called New Mexico is because when the Spaniards conquered with, when indigenous armies with the aid of the Spanish conquered Mexico City, Mexico Tenochtitlan, the people who lived there, the Spanish referred to them as Mexicanos. The language was Mexicano, the people, the Mexica, and the country, because they didn't pronounce it, Mexico. We did a whole episode on that, the use of the SH. But it's named after the city, the place of Tenochtitlan, which was called Mexico at the time. And the Spaniards, they heard all these stories because they saw, the beautiful, the architecture, the art, the ingenuity, the treasure, the gold, the featherwork, all of this, the splendor of Mexico, right? Of the city. And they heard these stories about how the Mexica were saying, well, our ancestors came from a different place to the north that they called Aztlan. And so the Spaniards got it in their heads, well, shit, we're going to go find this other place then. And they called it the New Mexico, that they're going to go and search. And in Nahuatl, it was referred to, like in the writings of Chimalpain and in the Crónica Mexicayo, they called it Yancuic Mexico, which literally means New Mexico, right? They were going to go in search of this New Mexico, hoping that they would find another place that had this, art and splendor and gold and treasure and slaves and women and all these things that they wanted to conquer. So they set out to the north looking for this place. And if you look at, just the historical record, I pulled up just some references here from, I think this writing was from 1608. And it says in Nahuatl, Inchan in Ompa Huehue Mexico, Aztlan, Kinihueyayan Chicomostok, in Ashkan, Quitocayotia, Yancuic, Mexico, which translates to as their home there in Old Mexico, Aztlan, Quinehuayan, Chicomostok, which today they call New Mexico. So they were like searching for this place to the north, this New Mexico, right? And it just blows my mind because one of the things here in New Mexico with the Hispanos of New Mexico is there's this pushback against calling yourself a Mexican. And they'll say, well, our ancestors weren't Mexicans because there was no such thing as Mexicans at the time, right? Because they're confusing the nation of national identity with ethnic identity. When in reality, the word Mexicano was used specifically to describe an ethnic identity. It was an ethnic label and the label of a language. It wasn't until much later that it was used, until the nation of Mexico was, 1821. People started calling themselves Mexicanos, right? And what cracks me up about these Hispano historians, and I'm making my little air quotes now, because they all love this poem. And I don't know if you've heard of this poem called La Historia de la Nueva Mexico. And it's like...
That's a poem?
Yeah, it's this long-ass poem written by... I can't remember the guy's name. Gaspar Perez de Viagra. Viagra?
The name sounds familiar. Viagra. Gaspar.
Yeah, and he wrote this poem in 1610. He wrote this poem. And it's about, Juan de Oñate's expedition into the land that would be called New Mexico, right? But... and I'm going to butcher this because it's in Spanish, but the first part of the poem, right? And these New Mexico Hispanos adore this poem. You would think they would have actually read it. Because it says, Canto primero, que declara el argumento de la historia y sitio de la Nueva México. And I just want to point out that they're saying Nueva México because, not Nuevo México, because... the O in Mexico is not gendered, right? It's a Nahuatl word. So it's an ungendered word. Y noticia que de la se tuve en cuanto la antiguala de los indios y de la salida y descendencia de los verdaderos mexicanos, right? So here it gives the translation, Canto 1, which sets forth the outline of the history and the location of New Mexico, and the reports had of it in the traditions of the Indians and of the true origin and descent of the Mexicans. And so if these guys who claim, well, there were no such thing as Mexicans back then, it's in your goddamn poem that you love so much. Like, it's right there in your face.
Well... it's not talking about them. It's talking about those Mexicans.
Yeah.
The Indian Mexicans.
The Indian Mexicans.
Not them.
Yeah.
Because they don't see themselves as Indian Mexicans. They see themselves as Españoles.
Exactly.
España.
So we know that at the time they were looking to the north for this New Mexico, right? And in 1581, during the Chamuscado expedition, I think that was the first time that the Spaniards put down on paper, because they came north of the Rio Grande, and they were like, this must be the place that the Mexicas were talking about, that their ancestors came from. So they named it, the area north of the Rio Grande, San Felipe de Nuevo Mexico. So this was probably the first Spanish use of the word in relation to this specific geographic area. And so our state has a Nahuatl name. And this story is so cool. Like, it's so badass. And there's this huge connection between, this place that we now call New Mexico and Mesoamerica, and this interchange that predates Spanish ever arriving here. But even through the Spanish colonization, when they brought up, Tlaxcaltecas and Mexicas and Purépechas and Mixtecos up here to colonize for them, this place is so deeply embedded with Mesoamerican culture, but all of that gets lost when they're just like, New Mexico is named after Old Mexico. It's the country. And then there's no curiosity. That's what gets me, I guess. There's no wanting to peel back these layers. There's no desire there, or this this drive to explore more, because the truth is always so much more fascinating than, you know, whatever the assumption is that the state was named after the country of Mexico. End rant.
Fascinating stuff. I did want to mention that I think the way they use Nueva Mexico there is in line with the old way of referring to land.
Right, like a feminine thing.
A feminine. Mm-hmm. So if you think of like Nueva España, it's in the feminine, right? Nueva Vizcaya. So they were just following that sort of line of thought, Nueva Mexico. And then over time it became Nuevo Mexico because the O in Spanish grammar is going to force the Nueva to be Nuevo. Yeah, over time. Yeah. And it's funny because I also, like, in my first couple of weeks of American history class, I bring this up with the students. In fact, we just talked about the Pueblo Revolt not that long ago. And there's always one student that asks me, well, why is it called Nuevo Mexico or New Mexico? And they said, was there a place named Mexico here? And I'm like, it's a good question. Yeah. Well, let me tell you. And so, you know, you've told me this before, so I kind of go over what you said, and it just blows their mind because everyone just always assumed that it was called New Mexico because it used to be part of Mexico, and it just kind of retained the name from, as opposed to, you know, quote unquote, old Mexico. So it's always fun to discuss that in class with the students.
And it's much more interesting, right? Like, it's such a cooler, I mean, because one, it's reality, but it's such a cool story.
I'm just thinking, how does all this, and this is something that came up just recently, again, in that conversation we were having, and as I was discussing this with the students, it occurred to me, because I brought up the other sort of myths that go along with the same idea of a New Mexico, you know, the riches to be had, you know, like in Mexico proper, right? And I'm thinking, I mean, but this trope goes all the way back to Coronado, doesn't it? With the 7 cities of Cibola and Quivira, and what else? There's I'm blanking on the other one, but there's another sort of myth that ties into all this. So were those the myths that the Spanish were creating in Mexico when they were thinking about the north and what was up there, right? And when they heard about Aztlan, why not call it Aztlan then? I mean, I know that in the Sterno map, the one that is used to sign the treaty between the U.S. Guadalupe Hidalgo, between the U.S. and Mexico, that there's a place name there that says Antigua Residencia de los Aztecas, right? But it doesn't say Aztlan on there, does it? I don't remember if it does.
It doesn't. No.
It doesn't, right? And so I was thinking, why go with Mexico and not Aztlan? If the Mexica literally called it Aztlan, and theoretically, even though the word Azteca already existed, the Azteca gains ground when the Spanish pick up on Aztlan and begin to use it to refer to all the people in central Mexico that spoke Nahuatl, whom they assumed all descended from the people that migrated south. Why not call it Aztlan instead of
That's
Nuevo
a good
Mexico?
question, because in the writings, like, so in Chimalpain's writings, and I have the Codex Chimalpain, Volume 1 right here. Kids, if you want to follow along at home, it's on page 73. And I'm not going to read all of the Nahuatl, but I'll read the translation. They're using all three, Aztlan, Chicomostoc, and Yanquic Mexico, like, interchangeably. Chimalpain does. So I'll read this little part here, and this is the English translation. He spoke to their leader, the ruler of the Azteca, Mexitin, who had been dwelling in the very great Altepet and city of Aztlan Chicomostoc, or, as we name it, Aztlan Aztatlan, the abode of herons. Hence, it is known as Aztlan. Now, Aztlan Chicomostoc is perhaps right by or near the very great shore, the great riverbank that the Spaniards now call New Mexico. It was there that Huitzilopochtli spoke to the Azteca god carried. There's the use of the word Azteca. He said to them, "Take those who are by the beryl cactus. They will be the first to pay tribute." And as the ancient ones said when they emerged from Aztlan, the name of the Azteca was not yet Mexitin. They all considered themselves Azteca. So,
Wow.
I mean, there's a lot going on in just that paragraph.
Chimalpain is basically saying that Aztlan was somewhere near the Rio Grande, the upper Rio Grande in northern New Mexico. Isn't that what he's saying?
That's what it sounds like, right?
Right.
That he's associating the two together.
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
So Aztlan is really in New Mexico. Who knew? Sorry, Californians. The world does not revolve around you guys.
Wah, wah. Boom, 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 boom.
Good one. All right, so I guess on to topic number 4. I don't know how deep we want to get into this. I actually wrote a little thing on this. I don't know, we might do an entire episode, who knows, but it's on the whole pretend Indian pejorative label that's been bandied about in recent years, but it's sort of gained ground in the last year or so. And those of you that are active on the socials and are plugged into the community, that native circles and to our socials, you might have seen some of this come up in conversation, and it's something that bugs me. I mean, it really deeply bothers me that we have people in the Native American community, interpreted broadly speaking, not solely, not only as in the United States, which is what some of these people do when they use the term Native American. And it's funny to me because a lot of the people that use the term Native American mean it to refer only people who are indigenous to the U.S. and Canada, right?
Yeah.
They always include Canada in the conversation. Yet, when you're talking about indigenous people south of the U.S.-Mexico border, those people aren't considered indigenous or Native American. I'm not talking about all Native Americans feeling this way, but there's this very small but very vocal and very, very mean-spirited minority of people out there who are targeting people south of the border as being non-indigenous. They're not considered Native American, and the indigeneity of the people from these communities is being called into question, including those of us who reside within the United States, who have deep roots here in the U.S., and whose ancestors straddle both sides of that dividing line between the U.S. and Mexico. We have indigenous roots here in the U.S., and we also have indigenous roots in Mexico. And by the sheer fact that we don't belong to some federally recognized tribe, and we don't have, the government issued ID that says we're a bona fide Indian, somehow that means that we're not quote unquote real Indians. And so this term pretend Indian is being tossed about to minimize, to diminish, to downgrade, and to just be completely horrible to people. I mean, I know you've seen some of the things that some of these folks are saying about indigenous people. Oh, they're not really Native American. They're just Mexican. What is that supposed to mean? Like, what are you saying with that? And, I know that by definition, someone who is a person of color who is not in a position of power cannot be racist, because racism implies power. And these people don't have any power outside of, their slacktivist circles that they belong to. But they're definitely following in that line and those patterns of bigotry. And it's very problematic, and it's really beginning to really grind my gears. Yeah. I don't know how you feel about it.
Well, it's interesting because their arguments, the arguments that they're using, parallel almost identically the arguments that right-wingers were using in the 80s against Mexicans and Chicanos. Like the same, like there was that one asshole from California, Glenn Spencer, who American Patrol was his organization, and he was tightly aligned with all these white supremacist organizations. And when they would be like, yeah, wetbacks, go back to where you came from, and whenever Mexicans would say, or Chicanos would say, well, we're native people, they would use these same arguments that are being used today. So it's interesting to see this parallel between people who I'm sure would think of themselves as very progressive or, leftist or whatever, mirroring anti-Chicano, anti-Mexican attitudes from the 80s from white supremacists.
Yep. And it's interesting because, I think you make a very, very, very interesting parallel there with what's going on now and what was going on in the 80s with some of these white supremacists. I feel like, and maybe it's just my perception, but I feel like ever since 2016, 2017, something happened around that period of time. And, people became a lot more mean-spirited, especially people on the so-called conservative, the family values side of the political spectrum, became very mean-spirited, very bigoted, very outspoken against people of color, against people who are different, who are deemed to be not real Americans. And that rhetoric that came out from that period of time, the interim when we had, the big blowhard in office, the big crybaby who was always, his very first utterance for running for president. I don't know if you remember this, when Trump came down those escalators and he got on that podium and started just bashing Mexicans. Yeah. Right. From that point forward is when I noticed that this increase of anti-Mexican, anti-Chicano, anti-indigenous people from south of the border began to sort of rise, and it's continuing, and it's been continuing to unabated, for going on 5 years now, 6 years, and I think it's a sad state of affairs when we have people from the Native American community echoing and parroting these racist words against people who, they might not consider them to be part of their own people, quote unquote, but they're still indigenous people. We're still descended from indigenous people. We still have connections to our indigenous roots and our indigenous cultures, and to not see that connection, right? I contrast this to 30 something years ago, right? Back during the Columbus quincentenary in 1990 and 1992, when Native peoples from both North and South America got together and they said, you know what? We see that the United States and we see that Europeans, Italians are, getting ready to commemorate the 500th, anniversary of the so-called discovery of the Americas by Christopher Columbus. We need to do something about that. How can we get together, our communities from the North and from the South, from the eagle and the condor? That's when that conversation began, the connecting of the two continents, and to offer a response, a rebuttal against, those types of colonialist and Eurocentric celebrations. And then fast forward, right? And all that happened in between, all the collaboration that occurred, all the friendships that were fostered and that were created, and the organizations that collaborated. And fast forward to now, and to see people within Native American communities behave that way is just so disappointing to me. It's sad.
Yeah, that's the best way to say it. It's disheartening and it's sad. And then you go even further back than the 1992 into the 70s, right? When we really had close relations with, Northern natives just straight up recognizing Chicanos as like, nah, you guys are our brothers. You guys are Native people. Let's fucking do this. And there was like this sense of unity that was so strong. And then you saw that resurgence of that in the 90s. And then now it's like, I don't know what happened, man.
Yeah.
These wokosos ain't as down as they think they are, methinks.
Well, man, speaking of wokosos, I think the wokosos are also a part of the problem, because in their effort to Latinize themselves, right? The Latinxers, in an effort to pin their identity under the white umbrella. Yeah, they've chosen Latinidad. Right. They've chosen to reject indigeneity, and they've opened the door for some of these individuals in the right wing Native American community to begin to target us as like recently I saw on the social something that someone posted about Mexicans. Oh, Mexicans aren't indigenous; they're just spicy Europeans. Like what? What does that even mean? What do you mean spicy Europeans? right?
Oh my God.
Exactly. And so, it's also people in our community who have dropped the ball on this and have allowed these kinds of attacks to not only open the door for them to happen, but also continue to happen because they have no pushback, because they don't see a need to push back against an identity that, or the denigration of an identity that they don't connect to, that they don't feel like they belong to.
Yeah, that they don't personally value. Therefore, it must not have any value to anybody.
Exactly, right. Yes. And then these people also target people within our own community for claiming and for, being indigenous, for practicing the ways of our ancestors. We get criticism from these folks as well. And that contributes to that same negative rhetoric that these other right-wing extremists, take, against our community. So I don't know. I mean, everything's a pendulum. As I tell my students in history class, everything's a pendulum. Things will swing one way and it'll be like that for years. It may be a decade before it starts swinging back. And I don't see it swinging back anytime soon. So
it doesn't feel like it.
Doesn't feel like it. I mean, I'll be pleasantly surprised if it is, and if it does. But all I can say out there to our community is that we got to stick together. We got to combat this proto-fascist rhetoric that's out there, even within our own communities.
Yeah.
And speak out against it whenever you can. Don't be afraid to speak up and put your name on what you stand for and what you believe in.
Absolutely, because if there's one thing that these people hate, it's the truth.
Yep.
And you know what I like to say about the truth?
What's that, homeboy?
The truth is like medicine. It doesn't always taste good, but it is always good for you.
Órale, carnal. It's good to be back, man.
Hell yeah. Timoitase. Thank you for listening to Tales from Aztlantis, a project of the Chimali Institute of Mesoamerican Arts. If you enjoy the show, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You can do this by visiting talesfromaztlantis.com and clicking Support the Podcast. Your continued support will help keep the podcast ad-free and independent. Until next time, Timoitase.